Are you pregnant or a new parent looking to ensure a better postpartum experience? Or are you a birth worker looking to improve your postpartum care skills? Check out Thriving After Birth, an online self-paced course by me, midwife and educator Tanya Tringali. It's 10 and a half hours of video content featuring experts in lactation, mental health, pelvic floor health, pediatric sleep issues. You also get worksheets and a workbook, as well as options to have a one-on-one session with me. Sign up at motherwitmaternity.com/thriving, and let's improve postpartum care together. My guest today is Katrina Fields. She is a Mother Wit Mama whose baby recently turned 1. We're going to talk about some heavy stuff today. So I just want to make sure everyone knows what we're going to talk about in advance so you can skip this episode if it's not what you need to hear right now. Katrina had cancer when she was 21 years old, and we're going to talk about that. And she had a lot of pain during her pregnancy, and then she had a 4th-degree laceration during her birth and a long road to follow. And in some ways, she's still on her journey. It's a long episode, and we go into some real depth about all of these issues. So either skip this one or get a cup of coffee and tuck yourself in and be prepared for a pretty profound and interesting listen. Oh, and a gentle reminder that nothing we discuss on this show should ever be considered medical advice. Please speak to your local provider about anything that comes up in this show that resonates with you and your needs and your health care. Katrina, it is so nice to see your face. I have genuinely missed you.
It has been too long. Not that long actually, but yes, I can always use more Tanya in my life.
Thank you. So I think I'm guessing, but I think it's been about 6 months since we've been in like really good touch. Is that about
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
And I think your baby just turned 1.
She did on Thursday. She's walking, running out into the street even. So it's a new phase we're in toddler parenthood life officially.
I know when I saw your post the other day of older toddlers pushing her around in the back of some sort of little truck.
Yes.
I was like, oh, where did the time go? I mean, every few days or a week of a former client or whatever, and I don't know if everybody's former even, that's a weird way of saying it, but somebody who I worked intensely with through the earlier postpartum period has a baby who turns 1, and lately people are starting to pop up pregnant with baby number 2, and I'm like, what is happening? Like, my life is just flashing before my eyes while other people raise babies. It's crazy. Anyway, okay, so it has been a while, and we had a really intense 7 months, I'm going to guess, or even closer to 8 months together. I think you need this opportunity, and in a way I do too, but I really value your willingness to talk to me about this in retrospect and to talk publicly about it. What we're going to talk about today is not common. It's not something that many people will experience, but it's a story and a journey that I think everyone who's ready to hear it can benefit from hearing. And so I'm really grateful to you, and I want to give you the microphone and the space and the time to do this, however it is that you need to do this. This is an opportunity for Katrina to tell her story. And I think for me as a provider to pull back the lens a little bit and look at how I went about supporting her, because in full disclosure, I think Katrina already knows this, I was flying by the seat of my pants some of the times. And I think she knows that, and I think it all went well. But with that said, I think there's learning hiding in little nooks and crannies of this story. So
Thank you.
thank you.
Yeah, I, I'm so grateful. I mean, I just want to say from the top here to have the chance to talk about this. Like you said, it's been a year. And when we were working together in the thick of it, everything was very tactical in a lot of ways, dealing real time with whatever speed bump was coming my way. So I agree, having the distance and the perspective zoomed out a little bit, and to just get to rehash this with you as such a present person that you were for me through this whole journey. I wouldn't feel comfortable having this conversation. So it is, well, it's been a year, it's still very fresh for me and new to talk about it in this narrative form. But you're absolutely the only person I would feel comfortable doing so with. And I hope, again, that cheesy line, if it can help one person, as you said, my story is unique, but I do think there is a lot in our culture right now about breaking down some of those harmful pregnancy, motherhood narratives, and letting the light shine through of the reality in all of its beauty and pain and trauma that accompanies this pregnancy, birth, postpartum journey. So I hope that my story in some small way can contribute to some of that reality to again help counteract some of those stereotypical narratives that I know can actually be really painful.
Yeah, I know that it will. Tell our listeners a little bit about yourself, whatever it is you're comfortable sharing about who you are and your family and, all that jazz.
Sure, absolutely. So I'm Katrina Fields. I am living in San Antonio, actually moved postpartum from Phoenix to San Antonio to be closer to family for a number of reasons, but have a beautiful husband, Adrian. We've been together for a long time, and we now have our 1-year-old daughter, Clover, just turned 1 last Thursday. And it may be helpful to say I work in healthcare. I'm not a clinician, but I do work in healthcare from an analytics and kind of consulting perspective. So my story is actually framed with someone who is probably more healthcare literate than the average person. So that may be a helpful just piece of context for everyone to have.
Yeah, definitely. I appreciate you throwing that in there. I'm going to let you take it back to what you consider the very beginning of this story, which is long before you and I met.
My journey, so to speak, from a healthcare standpoint, if you will, actually started back when I was 21. So in 2011, way back, I was actually diagnosed with stage 3 colon cancer. So I was 21 at the time and a bit of a medical anomaly. Doctors and physicians had not seen this stage of especially colon cancer in someone so young. They didn't know what to do with me. And it began my foray really into the medical world. I was thrust in unwillingly through this cancer experience. I underwent 2 colon resection surgeries. So I am missing about a third of my colon today. Became basically a professional patient at 21, at a time when all of my other friends were starting their careers and adult lives. I really had to be put on pause for a long time for this, professional patient role, and was in and out of infusion centers and hospitals and doctors' offices. And I underwent 12 rounds of chemotherapy during this time, and was still on a very tight medical leash even years after my treatment. I can thankfully say I have not had any recurrence from a cancer perspective. So, last year actually was my 10 years cancer-free. So it's hard to even believe that milestone is here. But again, kind of some helpful context to know where I came from a medical perspective, and in a way that definitely trickles into my birth story as well.
So you were in college when you got diagnosed, yeah?
Yes.
And so what, did you finish college? Did you take a break? Like, how did that part play out?
Yeah, great question. I had actually just graduated college. I graduated high school in 3 years, and I'm very young for my grade. Well, I did college in 4 years. I actually graduated college at 20 and turned 21 that summer. At the same time, all of this was boiling up. So a fortuitous decision to graduate high school early actually meant then my college uh, education wasn't interrupted. So I had just freshly graduated, and it was that summer after. So again, where this kind of plays in, of course, with this cancer history, I was diagnosed very young. And as part of that swirl around my diagnosis was this concept of a fertility consult before I would jump into my chemotherapy treatment, to talk through options for me. As I said, I was just out of college. I did not have a partner in sight. So this concept of fertility conservation, particularly in the face of a cancer diagnosis, was a swirl of confusion and, quite frankly, even an afterthought by my medical team at the time. Thankfully, we've come a long way. I know now there are whole teams and centers dedicated to exactly these kinds of consults, but I was, it wasn't handled in the best way for me. And I also wasn't in a headspace to really talk through the options with everything going on. So long story short, I did not choose to undergo any fertility, preserving measures in the face of my chemotherapy.
Wouldn't have that, if you had decided to do something like that, have delayed your treatment anyway?
Exactly. And that's a huge part. So again, you're given this diagnosis. I had my surgeries, had to deal directly with the surgical aspect. Once I was finished with my surgeries, they wanted to start chemo pretty quickly. And it was in that time frame that they said, oh, by the way, we should send you to a fertility consult. And so you're absolutely right. Every offer they were giving me around the fertility situation could have potentially delayed, the treatment that they're so clearly telling me that I need. So that definitely cast a light of, I wasn't interested in and not to mention too, I had just gone through surgeries. I'm about to go through chemo. So when they're saying we can jack you up with all these hormones, do egg retrieval, and they're walking, I'm like, but if I don't have to go through that extra degree of, invasion, I'd rather not. So even though it was on the table, like you're saying, from a timing context, from a already just under such a microscope of providers, adding that into the mix was really just not something I was interested in.
So take us to the next logical point, which I'm assuming somewhere in there, there's hopefully some space and a break from feeling like a patient. There's your career that evolves into something medical. Tell us a little bit about that time and space before you start considering pregnancy.
Yeah, absolutely. So I, again, am recovering well after treatment as expected, and getting my medical leash kind of lengthened a little bit more. And through this healthcare whirlwind that I was on, it really started my interest in how I could be involved career-wise in the healthcare field. And so I actually went to graduate school to get my master's in public health, initially wanting to work from a cancer prevention lens, and actually did a lot of that work for several years before pivoting into a more broader form of healthcare, which is patient experience, which is like I work in now. So it's not oncology specific, but it's really how are we smoothing this journey for patients from before they're in the office, while they're in the office, after they leave, from a communication standpoint, from the facilities, how everything is laid out, signing, messaging, you name it. So that's the career I'm in right now around patient experience. And it was absolutely informed by my direct experience as a patient in those early cancer days.
That's so interesting. I definitely want to have another conversation one day just about that and your thoughts about maternity care in that space, because in a strange way, although I've separated myself in a weird way from the more traditional medical system, I feel like that's a lot of the reason that I did it. So it's really interesting to hear
Yeah.
you, you are more actively involved in fixing the problems in the existing system, whereas I'm just kind of like, I'm out.
Well, and it's so interesting, right? We used to think about, patient satisfaction as like, oh, we've got really nice amenities and a chandelier and a fish tank in the lobby. And what we've really come to realize, our patients want the same things our providers want. They want clear communication. They want to be treated with empathy. And all of that isn't just a nicety, but it actually really has an impact from an outcomes perspective as well. And we know patients fare better when their needs are met. And so it really is a complex but interesting work for sure.
Okay, so career precedes meeting your husband, I presume.
Kind of in the mix there. Yeah, so while I was in graduate school, he's doing his thing actually in West Africa. He was a Peace Corps volunteer in education. And so we did a very long distance relationship. During that time, me getting my master's, him doing Peace Corps. And then after his Peace Corps service, he joined me. And we were able to move in together and eventually get married and start that teetering conversation of what is our family going to look like moving forward, which of course the cancer history played into. At that point in time, really flash forward 8 or 9 years probably at this point into my cancer remission. I happily married with Adrian, and pretty early on in our relationship, we started having conversations about kids and what that would look like. And with my health history, there was a part of my brain that had really wanted to come, be at peace with the idea of not having kids. It felt so vulnerable to want them. So it was safer to, kind of toe the line of, if we don't have them, I need that to be okay. And he was very much on the same page with that. Again, our life could look beautiful with kids, without. So we had a lot of those conversations, but the concept of trying was really vulnerable, not knowing what that outcome could be. So we got to a point, ironically, in the spring of 2020, there's national pandemic. I'm no longer traveling for work. There's a lot of contextual things happening that actually led us to start feeling this pull to at least just let's see what nature has in store. So I don't know that we'd go as far as saying we were trying, but we were not trying. So we were willing to kind of crack that door open and let's see. And I'd really come to terms with, trying not to have expectations either way. And actually ended up getting pregnant in June of 2020. So fairly quickly after, again, the pandemic is in full swing, but really felt like, wow, we cracked that door open and here it is, and very quickly began to embrace what this new journey for our life was going to look like, which was a whole new concept. Honestly, like I said, I'd really played out the not having kids decision, but I hadn't actually really let us go down this path emotionally. So pregnancy was really a whirlwind. But as I said, it was in the middle of the pandemic. So, my first OB consult was via telehealth. There was a lot of that mix into it. When I did start having in-person appointments, Adrian wasn't able to come in person to those. So we didn't know otherwise. So we just made it our normal to the best of our ability. But the bliss of the pregnancy news was somewhat short-lived, because around week 6, honestly, I had very severe nausea set in, a heavy cloud that honestly didn't let up until close to week 24, realistically, I would say. So a really long stretch of nausea and fatigue and food aversions. And what was so hard was this felt exactly like chemo to me. And I was surprised that this beautiful sort of gift of being pregnant could feel like that absolute worst time in my life. But in fact, I mean, it's eerie how similar the physical sensations are. And so right away, really, again, by week 6 or so, as this nausea is setting in, I'm realizing, oh, this is going to be an emotional landmine to get through this. And it's digging up a lot of my past trauma from my cancer history.
You know, I had sort of forgotten about the nausea and vomiting until you put it back in context. And then I instantly remembered that that's one of the first things you said to me when, like, when shit got real for me, was when you said the words, the nausea and vomiting triggered memories of chemo. I remember the feeling of my heart sinking and me saying, this might be bigger than me. I might not know how to help her. Um, but I had forgotten about the nausea and vomiting until one sentence later, because the second part is really what stuck with me. But also what I was thinking, and I don't mean to jump ahead. I want you to finish this thought, but it's occurring to me right now, and this moment is feeling heavy because now I'm recognizing that you went from the severe nausea and vomiting to something else that was painful that I know you're going to tell us about. And I'm really processing with this distance that you never got a freaking break. Like, I couldn't remember that in the moment because we were in it. And now with that lens looking back, I'm like, oh my gosh, you never got a break, Katrina. And I feel all the feels about that.
Yeah, it's so true. And again, it was my first time being pregnant, so it's hard to know that it's just not supposed to not have a break. But yeah, you're absolutely right. And that led to a lot of the really just frustration and fatigue, later on in my recovery. Yeah, for sure. And I will say it wasn't a full-blown hyperemesis, the HG. It was never to that extent. I know some women suffer with that, their entire pregnancy. So it was never that, but it was me constantly going back to my OB. I need help with nausea. I need help. I tried everything, over the counter, herbal, and did end up getting on prescription medication, which kind of took the edge off, to make me functional. But I was on prescription medication, probably till about 24-ish weeks of my pregnancy. It was just a landmine. And I started therapy very early on in my pregnancy because I had just so much to tease out. I realized there was still a lot unprocessed really from my cancer journey. I was so eager to just roll up my sleeves and move on from cancer that I didn't take the time to process a lot of that. And so it was all bubbling up with these physical symptoms. So started therapy very early to get support. And then Tanya, as you said, that's a huge draw to where my interest in your support came in. Because it was the pandemic, I had to curate a lot of my own birth education. There weren't hospital tours, there weren't classes happening. So I was reading books, I was gobbling up podcasts and courses, honestly, from a lot of Instagram birth educators who have been amazing. And one of those was actually Mommy Labor Nurse. And I was listening to your podcast, and I think it was a podcast probably with Liesel that you had done, and her talking about your support as a virtual postpartum midwife. And because I was in the thick of so much gray area around pregnancy of like, this is messy emotionally, like I'm not going to be a standard pregnant woman. And I was already needing so much mental and emotional support. I loved the idea of having somebody, not just a therapist, but somebody with the birth and postpartum acumen to be there in my corner after delivery to really help me navigate a lot of what I knew early on was going to be very gray.
Remind me when, or rather how many weeks pregnant you were when your next episode of pain began. And let's talk about that.
Yeah, so it was around week 30. So I might have had like 4 or 5 weeks in there of like, okay, I got this. The nausea was letting up. I'm getting excited. We found out the gender finally. I actually delayed finding out the gender for a long time. I just emotionally and physically was not in a place. So we found out a little bit on the later end her gender, again in that kind of good time, the few weeks I had there of like where I really could start to get excited. But around 30 weeks, I developed some really excruciating pelvic pain that came on. It felt like overnight. And I, through a number of trial and error and support, found out it was actually SPD, which is symphysis pubis dysfunction. And I'm sure you could explain it better, Tanya, but basically your ligaments are loosening and my pelvis is kind of just not sitting as it's supposed to.
Yeah, so just for our listeners' sake, the pubic symphysis is the space where the two bones in the front meet, and it's a very specific location in the front of the pelvis, and it tends to come with a very specific type of pain with certain movements. Pelvic floor physical therapists tend to be our best shot at getting help with this. There are pelvic belts and various other things that we might use.
Yeah. So, I mean, I was just in constant pain. It wasn't just like, oh, the occasional round ligament, shooting pain, things you might have in pregnancy, but it was constant, chronic pain. And when I did finally get support, I did pelvic floor PT, I did chiropractor, I did everything to try to help, and nothing really took it away. But I was told to essentially act as if I'm wearing a pencil skirt. So the pain really happens with spreading of your legs, which try living your life. That's how you move. It's how you get in and out of cars. It's how you stand, sit, walk. So my mobility was really limited. And it impacted my sleep, and got to the point where at the end of my pregnancy, I was taking like 3 baths a day because the bath was the only place, I could get some reprieve from this pain. So it was it started rough and then it ended rough for a different reason, my pregnancy and with this SPD experience.
Well, and then, what I remember is you were in the thick of this when we really started the bulk of our work together around 34-ish weeks pregnant, right? And I don't know where your head was at, but I remember this thought of like, okay, this woman cannot open her knees. You were starting to discuss with me the type of birth you wanted, how you wanted to go about it and why. And I started to worry about what is going to happen to this person during birth? What is her pain going to be like during labor? Maybe labor pain will be better than this pain. Maybe it'll make it worse. Like, I really didn't feel like I knew how to gauge exactly how to approach things. So we talked through lots of different scenarios and maybe this and maybe that. And then ultimately I enlisted Dr. Mel, who has been on this podcast already. You guys can scroll back through the archives and find that. Dr. Mel and I continue to collaborate to this day. I really like working with her. But what we did was have a virtual session with the 3 of us where we kind of like put our heads together on some ideas for Katrina's birth. Okay, so tell me what your memories are about that time and how you started to shift from living with pain to thinking about getting this baby out of your body.
Yeah. It's tricky because I began counting down, like it became clear nothing I was doing was helping the SPD. So it's like, let me just get to the delivery, so I started really thinking about and planning for that delivery experience. And there were physical things to think about. Like you said, we had that consult with Mel that was really helpful about just things we might want to try, things we might want to stay away from, specific to my SPD. but I was also planning around, again, my experience as a cancer patient. So because I had been so easily re-traumatized in early pregnancy with nausea and those feelings, there was a part of me that thought, well, here I am about to be admitted to a hospital for the first time in 10 years since my cancer surgeries. I'm about to be a patient and in a gown and hooked up to IVs. And it was causing a lot of anxiety for me. And while I knew the hospital was the setting I wanted to deliver in, I talked a lot with you, Tanya, about what options do I have to really curate this hospital setting that was important to me, but remove those elements that will make me really feel like a patient. And so they were small things, like wearing my own gown, for example, as opposed to the patient gown. And they were, big things as well. I chose not to have an epidural because I wanted that ability of movement and not having to be in the bed the whole time. You helped me recognize that even, fluids in some cases are an option, right? So that I don't have to be dragging around an IV pole. So there were a lot of, again, preferences, knowing that things could take a turn at any point, preferences that you and I lined up on a birth plan that I was at the time even sharing with my OB in our in-person appointments to say, here's what's really important to me, and kind of where my head is going into this emotionally, and then also physically, again, from that SPD component. So that was a huge help for me, that you helped me, navigate that experience, and we could go into the birth experience with at least, these intentions to help avoid what re-triggering we might be able to.
Then one day you wake up and you go into labor.
Oh, I wish it was quite that simple. Yes, so I was nearing a week overdue. My OB was watching me closely. I was having low amniotic fluid. So she was keeping close tabs on me and really saying, we may have to get to a point where we're talking induction. So she let me go on, as long as we could, but I think it was actually by like 40 weeks, 6 days, is when I was at another checkup with her. She's like, the fluid's gone down again. We need to have you induced. So that we knew that was a reality. We had our bags packed in case of that, but it just, it started that, oh man, I really was not wanting it to go this route, but I can remember in real time even texting Tanya, like, here's the plan, we're going in. So I start the induction process. They go the Foley balloon route. So I am using the Foley balloon, which helped me get to about 4 to 5 centimeters.
Just again, chiming in for our listeners' sake, a Foley balloon, for those of you who don't know. Basically, what we're talking about here is a form of mechanical dilation. So instead of using a medication that might soften the cervix or cause contractions, we insert a little tube into the cervix if it's open enough to get that in. So Katrina must have been, at least a half a centimeter to a centimeter open to get that in. And then we blow up this balloon. It's actually 2 balloons if it's called a Cook catheter, which is the more predominant one that's used now. Back in the old days, we just used an old Foley balloon, which is what we call a urinary catheter, and it just had 1 balloon and it sat on top of the cervix, and we kind of taped it to somebody's leg, and it kind of put pressure on the cervix from the inside. Now it's 2 balloons, one on the outside of the cervix and one on the inside of the cervix, and they kind of squish the cervix so it thins it out and also opens it up, and the balloon falls out magically when somebody's about 4 centimeters dilated. That's how, in theory, it's supposed to work. Back to you, Katrina.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. So that's was at least kick-started things. I started contractions pretty quickly from that. Was having to, use my own kind of coping techniques to get through the contractions. They were moderate at that point, I would say. I will just plug, there's a gentle birth hypnobirthing app that was really tremendous for me. I listened to those tracks a lot towards the end of pregnancy, so I was familiar with them. I knew which ones I liked and which resonated. So I was through almost the entirety of my labor relying on that app. But yeah, so the Foley balloon got me to 4 or 5 centimeters. It got to the point where it was, basically, ready to come out. And that's when my labor stopped. So once the balloon came out and wasn't physically holding my cervix open, I really had a bit of a stall in my labor, at which point they started talking low dose Pitocin to keep my labor progressing, which was hard for me to accept. Again, I had known going in, I was wanting to go without an epidural. I was wanting to go, again, as little patient as possible. So now it's, with Pitocin comes a lot of bells and whistles from a patient standpoint. But again, I can remember texting Tanya during this, and you were so reassuring. They gave me a little Pitocin. I wasn't responding, and I'm like, they want to do more Pitocin. And you were so helpful in saying, it's not about the amount they're giving you, it's about what it takes for your body to respond. And so, even with my amazing birth team there, my husband, and then my mom, who's actually a labor and delivery nurse, and for this story, served also as my doula. So they were an incredible birth team in there in person. I still can remember a few really poignant interactions with you, Tanya, throughout that process of like, okay, Tanya says it's going to be okay. But they need to do more Pitocin. It's okay. So it was, very memorable, your role in that, even virtually. But, the contractions picked back up, and I really, again, with perspective, I labored beautifully. And with the perspective of my husband and my mom, kind of telling me how that time went, I was very internal. I had my headphones in. I, really was exactly, laboring as I had wished, and tolerated it as expected. So the SPD did not make my contractions hard for me to say, I guess, but it wasn't like I had SPD pain during contractions. So that wasn't an issue.
Was it the case that contraction pain, I don't know if you can even say, but did it block your ability to feel the SPD? Do you kind of just feel like you didn't have SPD while you were in labor? Like, how do you reframe that?
Yeah, I would say I didn't really remember I had SPD. I labored a lot on my knees, I'd be like with my elbows up on a chair. So I wasn't doing a lot of spread leg things that would have caused pain. So I was in, again, from our consult with Mel, there were, positions we knew we had wanted to avoid. So I think the positions I was in weren't exacerbating the pain. And then obviously the impending discomfort of the contractions, overshadowed what SPD pain I would have felt.
That's also interesting to me because I did agonize more than is necessary about what labor was going to be like for you. And you were a full-on rock star, and the SPD was inconsequential. So, the best laid plans, and also like a reminder to everyone who worries or has anxiety. This is just one of those moments where you look back and you are so acutely reminded that worrying doesn't change anything. Worrying doesn't help. It's going to be good, it's going to be bad, but the worrying doesn't matter. And I really over intellectualized this aspect of Katrina's experience, and now I'm like, well, that was a big waste of energy.
Well, it will come into play a little bit later, but yeah, for the actual laboring process, it really didn't come into play. And I had like I said, a great birthing team in my husband and my mom, and really a hands-on nurse there towards the end of my labor too, who was tremendous in terms of suggesting different positions, and was, right there with me. I had a few contractions where I can remember, like, guys, and my mom would get back in my face and, help me breathe. And I'm like, okay, I got this, I'm recentered. And so, it went, I was progressing. Again, all of this is happening, within really a couple hours when I got back into active labor again from the Pitocin. So progressing quite quickly. I will say one of the things I was so grateful for in my labor experience was being educated on the stationing of baby. So we hear all about centimeters and how, what percent effaced you are, but I often feel like a stat that is missing out for us lay moms is the stationing, because I remember at my first check, they were saying, you're 90% effaced, only quote unquote 6 centimeters dilated, but I was a +1 station. And I remember clinging to like that third stat of like, oh, we've got this. Whereas again, 6 centimeters would have probably messed with my head that I had been laboring that long. And I say that long, but laboring so intensely and only at 6.
Well, I won't go crazy about it. I'll tell you what it is, and then I'll give you guys a resource that is brand new. That ironically we're talking about Dr. Mel a lot. So station is basically how high or low the baby is. The baby has to move through the pelvis. At some point in pregnancy, it's floating, and then its head dips into the pelvis, and then it gets really deeply engaged in the pelvis, and then it passes through the pelvis. So when we start saying plus numbers, we are doing quite well. So plus is always a good thing. Dr. Mel and I literally last week just released a birth prep course where she does the pelvic floor PT content and I chime in with midwifery wisdom. And we do, in fact, Katrina, talk a lot about station. I talk about how a baby moves through the pelvis so that people understand the complexities of that. And so it's a really great course, and I'll make sure to link it in the show notes.
Yeah, so being armed with that knowledge, like I said, especially helped know the baby was doing, what she was supposed to get where she needed to go. And sure enough, it wasn't long after that, probably within the hour, that I was then at 10 centimeters and +3 station and ready to begin pushing. And I have a very vivid memory. Up until that point, I'd been doing kind of all of just my own positions, doing the squat rack. And I have a very vivid memory when they said, it's time to start pushing. And they said, do you want to push on your back? And I said, in throws, whatever you recommend. And this just stands with me because, again, in talking about my SPD, and in some of that prep that you and Mel and I had done, we had really wanted to avoid pushing in that position. But in the haze of everything happening and like, it's here time, it's a blur, and yet it's so visible in my memory based on what happens later. But I pushed on my back for what felt like an hour. In hindsight, again, from my birth team, I now know it was only about 10 minutes, but I hated the pushing phase. It was the worst part for me of my labor. It felt very unnatural. I was out of breath and red-faced, and my baby thankfully was never in immediate danger, but there was an urgency. They're watching the heart rate of like, we've got to get her out. So I just wanted to do what I could to get her out as quickly as possible. And so she was delivered. It was painful to push out, but I didn't realize kind of the extent of it at that time, how much of a toll it took on my body, pushing her out. But they placed her on my chest, and I couldn't believe how big she was, honestly, was one of my first thoughts. And unfortunately, I really couldn't focus a ton on her because there was an urgency from the OB to get the placenta out. And so again, it wasn't an emergent situation. So I want to say that, I was healthy the whole time, the baby was healthy the whole time, but there, in hindsight, looking back, was some swift urgency to the OB. Like in my hearing other people tell their birth stories, it's like the placenta gets delivered eventually, right? But it doesn't have to happen right then. But the doctor seemed in a hurry to get the placenta out. And unfortunately for me, it was extremely painful. The placenta was kind of stuck. So I'm up in the stirrups where I had already been pushing. I'm still up in those stirrups. delivering the placenta and had to have my husband take the baby off my chest because that part was really painful. And I had to really focus on what the doctor was telling me. So it took about 30 minutes to get the placenta out. And at that point, I'm just like so ready to have my legs back together because my SPD, I'm definitely, to your point, Tanya, feeling the SPD at this point. I was ready to have my legs down after the pushing, but then had to leave them up for 30 minutes for the placenta. And I'm so just exhausted and ready to get back to my baby from that placenta experience just being a lot more painful and taking a lot longer than I had expected. And that's when my doctor informed me that I had torn, quote unquote, all the way through. And I knew from my birth education courses, actually, Mommy Labor Nurse has a very convenient Play-Doh demonstration of what the 4 degrees of tear mean. So when my doctor said all the way through, and then went on to confirm it was a 4th degree tear, I knew that was the most extreme kind. And I just lost it. So what was so it was so emotionally painful in that moment. I had done everything from my birth plan and preferences perspective to avoid this emotional re-triggering that I was concerned about, that in fact, didn't happen really up until that point. Again, looking back, I labored beautifully. I was able to get all of those preferences that I wanted. I wasn't thinking about cancer or any of that at all during my labor. And then here I was being told that I had not only torn, but I'd torn all the way through my rectum. So I was physically re-traumatized in exactly that bowel region where my, whole colon cancer experience was happened as well.
I will never forget when I guess it was I'm assuming you told me by text message.
Yeah.
I will never forget my feeling of first disbelief, and I can't imagine what goes through your head when you think of the series of things that you have been through in your life. But seeing that, I was like, I don't even have a word for this. Like, irony doesn't do it. I don't know what word I'm looking for right now. But that was intense. You are an incredible person, the way you have moved through all of this. But okay, back into so here you are with this news. You are falling apart. They need to put you back together.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't know if, again, so there's 4 degrees of tearing. 4th is the worst. I've torn through the internal and external rectum. Might be a education point, Tanya.
Just for simplicity, I think when you say tore all the way through, that is probably the easiest way for people to really understand this. On a slightly more technical level, you have to imagine that every part of our body is covered in skin, and we call the skin that is inside of parts of our body that are moist, so be that our mouth, our vagina, our rectum, our nose even, we call that mucosa. So that's another word for skin, but a very particular part of the body. Basically a 4th degree. So 1st degree is just the skin of the vagina. 2nd degree is skin and some muscle of the perineum. 3rd degree means that you tore into the rectal anal sphincter. And 4th degree means you reached and tore through the mucosa, so that inner skin of the rectum, which the reason people say tore all the way through is because for a moment in time, you have a passage now from the vagina to the rectum, and that must be remedied very carefully.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And again, in hindsight, though she didn't tell me till after my placenta was delivered, in hindsight, I think her urgency with the placenta was to begin that repair of my tear as quickly as possible.
Yeah, I actually am actively avoiding playing Monday morning quarterback on this because I don't think it's helpful. There is a voice in my head just to frame that idea where I'm like, the placental urgency may not have been real, but what I assume that there was some significant bleeding, and it can be very confusing at that moment. Like, we need to know where the bleeding's coming from. So I'm making an assumption there, but I'm not going to take that line of thinking any further because it doesn't matter at this point. Um, so nonetheless, there is something emergent going on, and for a moment in time, there was a question as to what it is, and how do we tackle this?
Yeah, and I had quickly, again, I had really wanted that golden hour, that, I had wanted to delay some of the baby testing to really get that skin to skin time in my initial birth plan. And even at the stage of the placenta delivery, I very quickly had to hand her off to my husband. I couldn't focus on her. I'm like, go get her tested, had really quickly passed her off because I was in patient mode. I was in my own brain of, trying to focus on what was happening. Yes, then the news of the tearing all the way through. My mom was there at my side, holding my hand at that point. My mom, who was also my point person, my everything through my cancer journey, is the one receiving that news with me. And she is just as floored as I am. She was right there for the whole delivery. Again, we've rehashed this in Monday quarterback to your point, Tanya. My mom was shocked. So there was my OB was shocked and my mom was shocked. There was nothing that in the time of delivery felt like that had happened or would have been a possibility. So she was just as surprised as I was. And at that point, I really just went inward. I don't really even remember my baby. She's there somewhere in the background with Adrian. And it's just feeling the most emotional pain of how am I back here? And honestly, I didn't, other than knowing that all the way through and fourth degree is the worst kind, that's all I knew. I didn't know anything about what it would actually mean, but just that knowledge alone was so traumatizing for me emotionally. And then physically, I am still up in the stirrups. I delivered without an epidural. So my OB is using local anesthetic to repair me for close to an hour. And it was excruciating. Like, I remember being asked, does that hurt? And just looking at them like, again, I think you're trying to make sure the local anesthetic has gone where it's supposed to go. So they'd hit a point that wasn't, numbed. And I can just blatantly remember being asked, oh, does that hurt? And it's just like, are you serious right now? Is that a real question? And it was physically painful and compounded by that just emotional, really just lack of composure at that point.
So you get through the repair, and then what?
So I did get to do a delayed golden hour with my daughter. We were able to get baby to breast. She nursed some, and got to, at that point, take some pictures and feel like some of the focus, on the baby. Yeah, it became very quickly apparent in the hospital that I wasn't going to be a normal, if that exists, quote unquote, type of patient. So my first memory of this was, of course, once you've delivered and have had a little bit of time, not a whole lot to recover, you then move to, in most cases, a postpartum room, which is separate from where you delivered. And I had to get transferred, to the wheelchair to sit down, and I'm in so much pain. I can't sit. I'm white knuckling the sides of the wheelchair. And then they go to they have my baby and they're like, and I'm gripping the wheelchair like, oh, I'm sorry, I'm supposed to hold her. They're like, I remember, again, those phrases that just stick in your mind. Most moms like to hold them, as they're being wheeled. And I can't sit all the way down on my bottom. And I'm like, I just said, I can't. And my husband had the backpacks and the wheel, cart of all of our gear. And they said, okay, we'll call a nurse to come wheel her bassinet for her. And I just remember waiting there. It was probably 2 minutes to wait for a nurse, but just that feeling of I'm supposed to be holding her, and this is the way it usually goes, and I don't know how to reconcile that. Not only would that be painful, like it is physically impossible for me right now to even fathom that. So the postpartum stay in the hospital brought to light some examples like that, where, again, most moms only need help on their first trip to the bathroom.
Were the nurses, again, this is a Monday morning quarterback thing that, like, in real life, this might not be so bad, but reflecting, it feels bad. Why did they feel the need to verbalize what most moms do? You're not most moms. Everybody knows it. We shouldn't need to talk about it. But am I just being defensive on your behalf?
You're not. And I think it was a very slow, trickled recollection of me realizing how severe this tear was. Again, I knew it was the worst, but nobody in that moment of recovery, my OB nor the nurses, there was no education. There was no, you might be on a different timeline. There was none of that. And so I had the knowledge of, like, I'm severely injured, but still be like bumping up against these boundaries of, like, what again, more standard type of recovery would be expected. And so it only unfolded in the days and weeks after delivery, the full extent of this. But yes, during my postpartum stay in the hospital, again, is also, while the delivery itself is very, a very prominent kind of traumatic memory, so is that postpartum stay in that room, and hauling myself in and out of the hospital bed to go to the bathroom without help, because I didn't know it was an option, to ask the nurses. And even pain management, for example. I mean, I was taking like heavy Motrin, and I'm finally trying to tell them I am in so much pain. And there was a new nurse that had just come on shift, and I remember her saying, has anybody offered you Vicodin? And I was like, I can have that. And so I take my one Vicodin, and then another nurse comes on shifts, and I said, I'm due for more Vicodin. And she said, well, are you on 1 or 2? And I was like, I can have 2, it was just this like unraveling. And it was at 2 Vicodin that I finally felt some kind of like something was touching my pain. But that wasn't just, and I get for a lot of reasons why that's not going to be the default, but that true conversation around what my pain was and pain management was a slow roll as well. So we had some beautiful moments in that postpartum room, and our first time as a family and alone and of 3, and some great pictures, but it's all recolored too by knowledge I found out in the coming weeks that I wish I'd had in that moment, that you just can't go back and change.
Yeah, I mean, look, in this Monday morning quarterback mode, I can't justify why it was such a slow roll on getting you comfortable. Like, my approach as a healthcare provider, when somebody's white knuckling the arms of the wheelchair, I've got all the information I need. Like, let's get this person completely comfortable and then pull back from the meds, not the other way around, like make them beg, slow roll, increase.
No, it's so true. And nobody gave me any indication that my experience should be different. So I started those early days with trying to fit the mold, trying to get myself to the bathroom and arrange a pillow fort under my bottom that, was at all as comfortable as I could be. But, for moms, when you're in those, you're nursing around the clock in those early days. And I couldn't sit without comfort. I had not only the discomfort from my actual, perineal injury, but I also had significant tailbone pain at that time that just made sitting completely not an option, but I muscled through in the postpartum setting because I didn't have anybody saying, let's figure out how we could get you more comfortable. Let's talk about some other positions.
Is it the case that your SPD pain went away as you got tailbone pain? Like it just basically shifted from one side of your pelvis
Yes.
to the other? So now you're dealing with the actual healing of the fourth degree, and instead of your pubic symphysis, your coccyx.
Yes, very fair. I hadn't thought about that, but it was just like a little pelvic trade-off. Yeah.
I can't even. I just can't. It's like
Yeah.
it's so do you feel like this is unfair?
So unfair. So unfair. And what I've had to come to terms with, I mean, one of my big kind of takeaways from dealing with this is having been someone diagnosed with cancer at a young age, I had really and come through it, I'd really believed I had gone through the hardest thing I would ever go through. I'd done my hard, like nothing can compare, right? No amount of suffering in my life could compare to that. And so to now be thrust into a situation where the physical suffering, the emotional suffering is in excess of that was really hard. Like again, so the unfair was like ×2 because I had unfair at 21, which is we never see this. And then I had unfair with my fourth degree, which I don't think we talked about this, but I've seen different statistics, but basically it's about 1% of vaginal deliveries end in a fourth degree tear.
I think the thing I want to point out is that all of Katrina's preparation, everything she did, I hope that people don't hear, well, her preparation didn't work. What was wrong with her preparation? Nothing. People who have a fourth degree, it's a freak fluke thing, especially, and I'm really emphasizing this point, if there wasn't an episiotomy. We know that episiotomies contribute to third and fourth degree laceration rates. Katrina did not have an episiotomy. This was going to happen no matter what. The only variable that we can even Monday morning quarterback here is the position she may have chosen to deliver in. And I'm sorry, I am hard pressed to believe, because I myself have had 2 fourth degree lacerations as a provider, and I've caught 1,200 babies. And one was somebody who stood up. She was standing and her legs were closed, and I caught the baby from behind her tushy, right? Like that's how this birth happened. And when I finally laid her down to check her, I was floored, right? So that's one. And the other one, the person was probably had an epidural and on her back. So that was more standard and traditional. But I've literally had 2 in my whole career. And neither of them can I explain. And how can you explain 1,200 other births that are completely reasonable and normal, right? So this is not about, in general, the provider. This is not, in general, about the person's preparation. There is something anatomical going on about that person's perineum, possibly. I mean, we don't even fully understand or know. So I really needed to frame that for people. And that's the context with which Katrina and I believe, started to unpack everything that needs to come from this point forward.
It's so helpful hearing you say that, Tanya. A year later, I still need that reassurance of just, there is a cruel randomness about the universe. And it was the kind of thing that kept me up. I mean, for weeks and months at night, if I couldn't, it was, like I said, replaying every moment. Was it when they asked me to push on my back? Had I not pushed on my back? Had I done this, that, or the other different? And you feel as the birthing person that it was on you. And we can talk about this a little bit later, but social media kind of being a double-edged sword. Like I said, benefited immensely from the birth education of a lot of social media birth educators. and have had to go on to unfollow or mute a lot when there's a constant rhetoric about how to avoid tearing. It's everywhere in very well-meaning accounts. But that every time I see that, I think, well, what, there's a way to avoid it, right? It gives that impression that it should have been avoided. And it's still a year later, something that I have to actively reset my brain on.
We would serve people better to use the language of, these are tools that can reduce your risk. And I think that what happens is, especially when somebody's selling something, the language of sales overtakes what is more pure and sound medical language. And I try not to do that, but having this conversation is really helpful for me to check myself on that front. So let's jump back in. Where are we?
Yeah, so we get, discharge. I really didn't have to stay extra amount of time. Again, they were kind of just pushing me in the bucket of like normal. And rightfully so. I was so uncomfortable in the hospital. My mom couldn't be there with us because again, COVID time. So it was just Adrian and I and this new baby. So he's really on, her duty with the exception of feeding. I will say, thankfully, she was a great eater from the start, nursed well. It was just so uncomfortable for me to be sitting and nursing her. So by the time we got home, I had my mom, so like a whole other person, right? Because we needed like kind of girl to girl coverage, so to speak, somebody on the baby and somebody on me, because I just needed that degree of hands-on support. And my mom, thankfully, again, with her background as a labor and delivery nurse and also the mom of 5 kids, is well-versed with breastfeeding. And very quickly, we started kind of the breastfeeding Olympics, if you will. We were in every possible position you can imagine to try to get me comfortable and, Clover comfortable to nurse. And, my daughter was such a trooper with everything we tried, but, really exclusively ended up sideline nursing, which again, wasn't talked about at the hospital, wasn't something I knew was an option. When you see, images of women breastfeeding, it's not laying down. And for, months, I just about exclusively nursed laying down, but it was like a side lying, and then eventually kind of graduated to like a reclined seated nursing. But I could not sit straight up. And so we had to accommodate and find options.
And there's a point at which, if I remember, but I just don't remember where it is or how long it is, your pain from the actual healing of where the stitches were in your perineum became lesser, and the tailbone pain became the more dominant pain. And I remember this, I don't remember when, so that's what I want you to clue me in on, but I remember this becoming the thing that I started obsessing about that replaced the SPD. That's how come I thought of it the way I did, where I went on a mission, because I started to feel certain that, okay, for whatever reason, whatever is going on in Katrina's pelvis anatomically, this baby broke her tailbone while at it. And while there's nothing in general anyone can do about it, it was really hard to sort out from your verbal description sometimes if the pain was actual tailbone pain, if the pain was just radiating so much that it seemed that way. There was a long time of it being pretty confusing.
Yeah, absolutely. Because again, I've never given birth. I don't know what, post-birth is supposed to feel like, but I did, from even in the hospitals, just saying my tailbone hurts. That was just a constant thing. And I remember, Tanya, you kept coming back to how early I had reported that then my immediate healing took precedence. I had a lot of bruising as well. So there was, reasons why it just hurt to sit. And then I would say, maybe around the 5 to 6 week mark is probably where it switched. Do you think? Yeah, I don't know. It's kind of a blur. I know at 6 weeks is when I was curious to start, maybe closer to 8 weeks, starting to look into pelvic floor PT for the tailbone piece.
Yeah, I just remember that I went to a webinar by a specialist.
That's right. Yes, yes.
Specialized in tailbone pain, because I was so desperate for information from you. And I don't know if this is accurate, but I felt like your in-person team was blowing off your tailbone pain, lumping it into your healing, and I was never convinced that that was the case. I don't remember if something was going on or it was just what you needed emotionally and psychologically. You wanted to be seen and your provider didn't want to see you. Tell us about that part.
Yeah. So when I was discharged from the hospital, again, in postpartum, I was seen by another provider. So not my delivering OB, but somebody from her practice. He, again, kind of looked at me, mentioned some extra bruising, and said that my doctor would want to see me before the 6-week standard 6-week appointment. And I'm sitting there like, my God, I would hope so, you know? So I had that comment made. And then I think there was talk of like 2 or 3 weeks, but again, the people discharging me at the hospital weren't the ones who delivered me and, you know, really knew the extent of this. And so I think what ended up getting put on the books was maybe 2 weeks out. I once discharged home with gripping my Vicodin in hand that I insisted I come home with. I'm like, can I come home with this? They're like, oh, we could write a prescription. Again, just having to advocate constantly of like, I can't be without this. And as that medicine was starting to run out, that's really where I was starting to get nervous. I mean, just speaks to the amount of physical pain I'm in. I'm someone who, again, had just labored, you know, unmedicated. Like I know pain, I know discomfort, like I've been through the ringer, and yet the idea of this Vicodin running out, I mean, I couldn't fathom.
And I just want to point out also, you managed your way through an unmedicated birth, the 4th degree repair with local, which is insanely difficult. And there is no reason we should be questioning the severity of your pain. So another pain point for me was that I immediately recognized that your pain was way more than even people I'd seen with 3rd and 4th degree lacerations, right? Because even though I've only experienced 2 as a provider, I think people should realize that I've worked in group practices. So that doesn't mean that I don't round on somebody postpartum or take those phone calls from somebody else's delivery because I'm still their primary midwife. So, I mean, I have much more experience than just those 2 when it comes to 3rd and 4th degree lacerations. And I know what that pain report looks like. And Katrina was white knuckling every minute of her life. And it wasn't normal. It wasn't okay to just say, this is the way it is, just stay home till 2 weeks or whatever. Mm-hmm. I also think you, if I'm remembering correctly, I think you sent me pictures so that I could see like where things were at in terms of swelling and bruising and all of this stuff, because I was very concerned about where you were at and what the real source of your pain was, because swelling and bruising can be super painful. So like, okay, maybe that's really what this is. Maybe it is just going to take more time. But there were all these ideas floating through my mind that there were things we weren't addressing.
Yeah. So yeah, I completely agree. And for that reason, I did strong arm my way into a 1-week appointment. That maybe sounds a little more confident than it was. It was actually a lot at your urging and really my mom's urging, just from a medical perspective, like, you're in pain, your meds are running out, you need to be evaluated. And I remember calling, speaking to an MA saying, oh no, you're on the books for, you know, usually the doctor doesn't want to see until 2 or 3 weeks, because that's at the point where you can tell if it's healing appropriately. And I'm like being coached in real time on the phone, because as you're so emotional as a new mom and you're trying so hard to not be that demanding patient. I want to just, you know, just do what, if there's a supposed to, I'm trying to do the supposed to. And it was so hard every time I bumped into one of those boundaries to have to overcome that in such a vulnerable, uncertain space. And it took a lot of my team around me kind of rallying for me, but I was able to get in and be seen at a week, at which point my OB could physically, if it's just even like you're saying, the white knuckling, could tell instantly how much pain I'm in, you know, because I'm just standing in the waiting room because I can't sit. I'm standing next to the exam table. I'm like, I can't sit on that. So being able to lay eyes on me in person, she was able to, again, to your point, Tanya, I think just really get the sense of she's in so much pain, and that softened her. And I think, again, being able to see the bruising and swelling, and nothing was wrong at that point from what she could tell, even though it was still so fresh. But to get in, she renewed my my Vicodin prescription, again, saying we will work on a step down plan when that time comes, but you need to have this managed. So she was really crucial in that. And also I had to pull out of her, tell me what happened. Like, how did we get here? And it was so emotional, that visit. I mean, I went through probably a whole box of tissues. She stayed with me for probably 40 minutes in what was supposed to just be, you know, a little check-in. But I needed to hear from her. When did you know? What did you, you know, were you surprised? You know, I had so many questions, and I just emotionally needed that debrief so intensely. And I hate that it took me like muscling my way in to get that. And I think from a care provider perspective, you know, and really that trauma informed lens, you know, to have been in postpartum and had a nurse or anybody at any point sit down and say, you know, it was hectic yesterday. I know a lot happened. Do you have any questions? Is there anything, you know, do you want to walk through this with me? I needed that, and I eventually got it, but in a self-induced way.
Yeah, and that's definitely something in the system that just absolutely has to change. I think midwives are better at this, but sometimes, again, busy midwives, time just doesn't allow for it. In theory, midwives debrief every birth, right? Like every birth needs a touch point with a day's remove, and again at a few weeks remove, and again at the 6-week visit, and hey, at your annual visit a year later even. Like, thoughts will always arise from your birth for the rest of your life. My birth frames who I am so much, for better and for worse. My birth is a piece of who I am, and I can only imagine, you know, with some more years removed, how you will reframe this over and over and over again.
Yeah, exactly. And I do remember you were so crucial in that component as well. And that in part of your Mother Wit program, I mean, there's a standing like birth story discussion day, and I needed that then. And I also had questions, you know, from my team that was there and in person. And so I think being able to hash that out with you jump-started my ability to then take that to my OB to get the answers I needed.
Yeah, I mean, rehashing with me doesn't make up for not rehashing with the person that was present by any means. But I offer this to people because I know that most people aren't getting it, and simply having somebody who understands what happened. Like, I can usually fill in blanks for people when they're telling me their story and they're saying like, and then this thing, and I don't really know, but, and I'm like, well, I think what was happening was, right? And so I can give context to these things, kind of like when you had questions about Pitocin in real time. I contextualized that in the moment. It's very much like that. So that needs to happen for all births, no matter how minimal the trauma or how big the trauma, because trauma's in the eye of the beholder. I can think somebody just had a good birth experience, but they remembered seeing, I don't know, an instrument on my table and thought I was going to use it, and I didn't, but they're traumatized by that. I'm making something up on the fly, but just to make the point that like nothing happened, but that person had a split second that has become a trauma. And we have to find those pain points and talk them through. Talking them through is how we heal. It's the basis for which we heal.
Mm-hmm.
And you and I spent a lot of time talking. Not only time talking, I will say, like, you know, you and I have a way of working within Google Docs that was really wonderful. There was an organization to it. Like, you kept me on task, And I always knew where your head was at and what you needed. It wasn't about my timeline anymore, right? It wasn't like birth story here and we talk about 6-week visit here. Like it went out the window. I clearly needed to hear your birth story early on. That's a given.
Yeah.
And from there, it was just like you ran the show. We were in touch every couple of weeks in a virtual session and, of course, by text message every day. And it was just, what is happening right now? What do we need to work on right now?
Yeah.
Nothing else matters.
But having those prompts within your timeline, even though we maybe rearranged things, was so crucial. Like I said, the birth story piece and integrating the mental health component as well. I feel like we may have pulled on that probably earlier. You're like, again, you can offer it at this point, but we can do it earlier if needed. And that was something that became so clear that I needed that support. And without you and access to your program, that would have just been another to do, to like in the middle of managing my pain and my bouts, like find a therapist to talk to. But the beauty of working with you and through your program was like, it's on the docket. I've got the person. You tell me when. I'm like, half dressed and on chat, with Jen, and it was so crucial to have that just built in.
And something I've never really thought about before in terms of just the design of the program is, if we're not ready to talk about something, at least you on the other side of this conversation still knows that this is something that is that we haven't tackled yet. And so that there's some step that I consider part of postpartum processing and healing that we need to try to get to when it's the right time. And that's why we spent so much time together. And this wasn't my standard, we do this from 36 weeks to 12 weeks postpartum. This was like, we started a couple weeks early and we went on for a good 6 months postpartum, because that was your timeline. We knew what wasn't addressed because you weren't ready, rightfully so. So, okay, are we about at the point of the story? And tell me if I'm jumping ahead, because feel free to interject. But I feel like we're edging on talking about when we needed to get you to a physical therapist, and whether or not you want to talk about you changing physical therapists or anything is totally up to you. But we needed to get you to somebody, and there were dramas within that whole thing as well.
Yeah. So I had dabbled in pelvic floor PT towards the end of my pregnancy with SPD, but it was, again, I think being in my 3rd trimester, they were hesitant to really do a whole lot with me. So it was kind of like, try these exercises, try these stretches. So I thought it was more like sports PT. So I didn't really have a full understanding of what pelvic floor PT was until I saw a new therapist in postpartum, because at that point I really wanted someone who was specialized in perineal tear work, like just that had seen other patients. I didn't want to just be in like a sports gym with someone who maybe does some pelvic work. And so it was a winding road to find my therapist. It's not covered by my insurance. I had one kind of was blowing me off and not scheduling, which was really hard. But I did finally land on a therapist, Thrive Pelvic Health in Phoenix, since I was living in Phoenix at the time. Would love to shout out Kim there. She was fantastic. And I went in with some pretty immediate complaints, being my tailbone pain that we couldn't quite figure out. But I did learn through Kim, kind of, if you look at the anatomy of your pelvic floor, your tailbone is just nestled right in there amongst all of those muscles. And so it helped piece together why trauma and having trouble with my pelvic floor is perhaps impacting my tailbone, because my brain just kept like those are two separate entities, right? But to see a model and to get some of that basic education was helpful. And then to do actual hands-on release work ended up being really, really crucial. And winding as well. It was trial and error. We'd try a few releases. She'd say, okay, go home, tell me how that is. We'll try again. And it took a lot of discovery work together to be able to get some relief from that.
And by hands-on work, just again, for our listeners' sake, I believe this means internal work, meaning that somebody, your pelvic floor PT, uses 2 fingers through the vaginal wall to explore the musculature, the deeper musculature of the pelvic floor. On that note, though, how much of the work was musculature? How much work was there that was scar tissue? How did some of that play out?
It ended up being a lot more musculature from her standpoint, less about scar tissue. And because some of my chief complaints, in addition to the tailbone pain, was pretty excruciating pain with bowel movements. We also, when talking about internal work, also happened rectally, and that was just needed. And, you know, it sounds so intimate, and it was, and I would strongly recommend you find someone that you're comfortable with and, you know, feel safe with. But at the same time, there was a degree of like, this was the area impacted. Like, I want somebody assessing it and really, you know, helping figure out what might be lingering beyond the initial just healing, which was within my OB's domain. You're healed, but everything internal from a muscular standpoint, scar tissue, all of that is where the pelvic floor PT was able to help. So there was a lot of different release work done. My pain was interesting in that it wasn't like acute. It wasn't like anytime I sat instantly there was pain, at least at this point in my journey, because I had healed initially from the tear, but it was more moving from sitting to standing. So there were some technicalities I was able to share with her about when and how my pain occurs that helped her zero in. And well, if the pain is happening while you're sitting, let's try to do release work from a sitting position, right? So we were kind of doing, you know, all sorts of maneuvering to find that pain point and do the release in the place where there's pain. So yeah, but I did pretty quickly start to see within probably a few weeks some relief from that pain. And she had also recommended a special pillow for me. So in the meantime, while we worked to get to a more intense relief, she was able to offer some great kind of supplies, dilators, things to help from at home, that aided my recovery as well.
How many months postpartum were you when you got on an airplane for the first time? Because I remember that being a big milestone for you.
Yes, it was the 4th of July. So I had my daughter in early March, and yeah, by the 4th of July, I was on an airplane, but I had my like tailbone pillow as a carry-on. So I was out in the world, like pretending I was free, but like every minute there was still like one of our carry-on bags had to be my pillow. So yeah, but I was being able to get a little bit of freedom, yeah, by July.
Yeah,
that was a milestone.
So where are you at now? And again, please, if there's anything in between the points that I'm starting to reference as we get farther out that you really want to hit on, I want to give you the space and time to do that. We've been so thorough that I don't want to mess it up now by jumping ahead too much. But of course, my curiosity is I've missed you for 6 months and I need an update. But please, if there's anything before that.
Yeah. Like I said, I think I just want to hit on the therapy component as well and the birth trauma component. I learned a lot through therapy, and again, the beauty of social media, have found the Birth Trauma Mama on Instagram has some fantastic content, and what she has shared has helped me heal so much. But you know, recognizing that you don't have to have almost died for it to have been trauma. Your baby doesn't have to have almost died. So that was messy for me to sort out in the beginning, that like, here I am, healthy, right? Like I've survived, which if that's the goal, I've survived, and my baby has survived. And so how to hold space for all of those huge feelings I had, you know, juxtaposed with both of our inherent health. And so the therapy was really powerful, and being able to claim it as trauma and talk about it as trauma, was important because, you know, as Jen, my therapist, you know, really helped me recognize there was one event, you know, the birth of my daughter, and there were two different tracts of experience. There was my experience as a mom, having my daughter come into the world in that moment. And there's also what I went through physically as a woman, take the mom, daughter, you know, birth part out of it, just medically. And, you know, what I went through as a woman. And those are separate tracks that, you know, both have to be tended to. And it's so hard in those early days because they get muddled. And so it's, oh, but look at her, she's so beautiful, isn't she worth it? And I'm sitting there torn all the way through, you know, dealing with everything I'm dealing and thinking, so I have to be completely mangled, you know, for that to be worth it. And there were so many messy feelings in the beginning that needed to be teased out. And again, some of those narratives of, oh, but at least you have a healthy baby, at least the worth it one was really a hard one for me because it made me just feel disposable. And I can really remember in some of those early conversations with Jen, you know, saying, nothing is worth you having to go through this, you know, and I needed that kind of validation. Whereas some of the family and friends I was, you know, maybe dealing with, or, you know, had a different perspective of just, but the baby's here. And so being able to get some clarity and some support just for me and all of those messy, really hard challenges I was having, you know, bonding was really hard in the beginning. And those are really isolating thoughts when you're dealing with a new baby to have to tackle.
You know, I think that these are points that every listener can relate to, especially those who already have a baby in their arms. And maybe this is about some form of emotional intelligence, but we have to be able to hold two opposing thoughts simultaneously, right? Like, that's what being a human is all about. On one hand, I love this baby more than anything. And on the other hand, this is really freaking hard. And a million other thoughts that I think everyone listening can think for themselves. I don't need to fill in the blanks here. But, you know, we're on a different plane, I think, in terms of your story. With that said, the basic idea is something every single person can relate to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And in those early days, I mean, a lot of, you know, we had to do a lot of role reversal, as I'm sure perhaps maybe other listeners, if you've had any degree of, you know, even maybe a C-section recovery, just it's different. You know, my husband was the chief diaper changer. He even slept on the side of the bed where the co-sleeper was. We had a little co-sleeper attached to our bed. I couldn't get up to maneuver around the co-sleeper, so he slept on that side. Anytime, you know, for baby wearing, he wore her for weeks before I was ever able to do that comfortably. So it was, you know, there's just a lot of logistics too and accommodations that you think, well, I'm supposed to be able to do these things. And I'm not, and grateful I had, you know, the partner to help with that. But it was hard watching how he could maneuver with her physically, how he could just love her. Like I just watched the love like shooting out of his eyes in those early weeks, and just hoping that someday I could feel that kind of uninhibited love. But it was so inhibited in those early weeks. Like you said, I loved her, and the most awful thing that's ever happened to me happened. And that happened because of her, right? You know, so I couldn't just look at her and think she's beautiful and I love her. I saw flashbacks and all of that. And I will say at a year now, I do have uninhibited love towards her. And as time and space and a crap ton of therapy and processing and work, been able to, you know, start to tease out those experiences and have more memories with her beyond that birth. You know, in those early weeks, and days, that's all you have. And it's so fresh that you don't have good memories to like counteract. Whereas, now as she's taking her first steps, as she's in the bath and signing duck to me, and I think she's a prodigy, all those like fun moments, it's just like a little jar, a little pebble in the jar each time that doesn't at all take away the trauma, but just makes it easier to carry those truths, at the same time.
Wow. Yeah. And how are you doing physically at this point? What has the journey been like since we last spoke? So what I remember about our final conversations before life got really busy for you and you started moving and all of the things that happened, is that you were, much more able to live a normal appearing life. That doesn't mean you were 100%. I want to say that you were maybe about feeling about 80% better. You had profound success with the pelvic floor PT, but I don't believe you were 100% last time we spoke.
Yeah, I would say that's about fair. And when I worked with my pelvic floor PT in those early days, she said kind of like 75% was her goal. So we got me to like 75%, and the rest is kind of just tools in my tool belt and just assessing as time goes on. So I have since moved, so I'm now in a new city, so I can't go to my old therapist, unfortunately. So I have started the search, and I think identified what will be my new pelvic floor PT, because I am wanting to go back kind of for phase 2. Again, that early process was so acute. I'm having immediate pain with these instances and getting those addressed. And now it's just more some chronic things, both from a bowel perspective and just, trouble with my sphincter. I like to say my sphincter doesn't sphinct. I just made up that verb. But, there's, bowel management has been, it's not a full-time job anymore. It was a full-time job in the early days and weeks of my recovery. But it's still not ideal. And so I do just want to go get reassessed again. It's been a year. Get some of that. And then I am still having some lingering tailbone pain. It's much improved, but just wanting kind of a round 2 assessment. But otherwise I'm able to walk comfortably. My husband and I went for a couple mile hike on Friday. I have started to swim laps again. So there are a lot of physical wins happening, but it has been slow. It has been so slow. And I know, Tanya, you're a big fan of like doing away with this like 6-week like check mark for women. At 6 weeks, you're like cleared to like go live your life. That's not the case for a lot of women. And it was not the case for me. If anything, it's been more like 6 to 9 months before I felt like I was really able to step out of that immediate recovery phase.
Of the activities that you just mentioned, I'm just curious, are you doing all of these things truly pain-free, or do you endure some degree of discomfort at some point doing those activities? What's that like?
Yeah, that's actually a great comparison. I would say I've moved away from the pain. I'm more in the discomfort phase. So there is, and it's occasional, right? So it's not a constant pain, which was the case in the early days. Now it's occasional discomfort, a lot of walking or activity. I just feel some kind of uneasy, pulling in my, perineum that can just be uncomfortable. Or after a day where I'm doing a lot of walking or even sitting sometimes, it's like I go to stand up and it's like, oh, my tailbone is just still, it's kind of wonky, but it is more discomfort than pain. And so while not perfect, it's progress in the right direction, and still also something I don't want to just settle into if I don't have to, which is why I want to sort of dust off the pelvic floor PT again.
Have you been standing for the 2 hours that we've been speaking?
I have. So there's just certain things where it's just, again, it's just not comfortable for me to to sit. So even I'm at my work computer, right now in my home office, but I have a little, cushy mat, and I stand throughout the day, and can take little breaks of sitting. But what doesn't work for me is sitting as my primary. And so again, just kind of accommodating around that.
Do you feel comfortable talking to us a little bit about intimacy?
Sure, sure. Gosh, yeah, this fits into the timeline situation as well of 6 weeks, right? At 6 weeks, yeah, I can't even tell you where I was at 6 weeks, but not at all in a place to healing wise.
You were still in constant pain. I can tell you where
Yes,
you were.
yes,
You know too.
still in constant pain. I hadn't even started the PT at that point. Yeah, so I definitely was in constant pain, and yeah, so I would like to take a second to plug also, there is a 4th degree tear support group on Facebook. It was founded by Laura Fry, who's amazing. And I found more solace in that group. Again, the double-edged swords of social media. It's like, it's good. And, it can be painful and so healing. That there's a single Facebook group for the entire world. So there's people from other countries weighing in about their 4th degree tear experience, but that's how rare this is. And while I want to be critical of the medical community, it's hard to be when, as you said, Tanya, you see a couple of these in your whole experience. So even providers can maybe point to like 1 or 2 anecdotal points, but by no means is that a proper sample size. So this Facebook group is specifically for 4th degree tears. And I happened about it in a random series of events. I was in a different birth group, had shared about my experience. Someone said, there's this page, you should check it out. And I checked it out, and it was like, these are my people. And I really needed that. And it can be tricky because you don't know what stories you're going to happen upon or what experiences, but at least they're people in the same boat. And what's beautiful about that group is we were able to share about everything, medical, sex, intimacy, bowel habits that a lot of times we weren't able to share, with our own friends or loved ones. And so that became a real treasure trove of information. And one of probably the most common threads and talked about discussions in that group is at what point were you comfortable, to return to sex, and the timelines. I mean, I remember reading these so early on in my recovery where it wasn't even on my train of thought, but for some women, years, for some women before the 6 weeks, for some women, months. And it was so varied, but to just have that transparency was really helpful to know that there isn't a standard answer.
What I'm finding so interesting about hearing that is, and I don't mean to minimize your experience, that I'm not, that is true for everyone, whether they tear or not, or what degree tear. So that's kind of a fascinating parallel, but that you had to find yourself in this group for that information to be meaningful to you. You needed to be spoken to about you and your unique situation that so few people could speak to. The truth is that information is true for everyone.
Yes, just breaking down those like hard and set rules. And again, I think had I had a more traditional recovery and just had that 6-week info, to go off of, like that's all a lot of women have, is whatever information they cover at that 6-week visit. So I never felt pressure to hurry the timeline along. My husband obviously was very accommodating to that. And like I said, knowing this large range of timeframes of other women who'd had a similar injury gave me the wiggle room to like just take it as it comes. And Tanya, you were really helpful too in taking a non-heteronormative lens to this. Like again, the idea of quote unquote sex equaling intercourse is a completely heteronormative, projection. And there is a much wider array of intimacy that is available to you, whether it's showering together or, just all sorts of other things that don't have to involve immediate penetration of that area that has, so many of the concerns and vulnerabilities around it.
Yeah, I think one of the things that, and I do talk about this with everyone, I think I emphasized it even more with you to help you find your path, which, by the way, I can tell that you would have found your path without me on this front, but nonetheless, everyone deserves an outlet to speak about this in a comfortable way. The truth is, if we call it intimacy and not sex, we have already like kind of taken this narrow view of what sex is off the table to begin with. And now we're just talking about reestablishing our physical relationship, which a physical relationship can be everything from looking into each other's eyes to hand holding to slow dancing to, non-penetrative forms of sex, right? Like this idea of virginity is so ridiculous. And there's so many ways that we can expand upon that. And I think when somebody's had trauma in this part of their body, whether that is from childhood abuse, sexual abuse, through the gamut, obstetrical abuse, a bad experience that was nobody's fault, we have to find healing and happiness in that part of our body. So how can we experience pleasure without risking the potential of experiencing pain? And that's a lot of the reason that I walk people through the way I walk people through. And then you just become kind of like the pinnacle of the person I wanted that the most for,
Yeah, it's so true. And then it becomes, a milestone, whatever the milestone is, that's like so small, whether, whatever that needs to look like, those early intimate moments with a partner are just as special and as, big of a, milestone as, oh, we've officially had intercourse. It's, wow, this happened and I didn't have pain, or this happened and I felt more connected to you. This happened and I didn't feel like a mom, there can be so many milestones associated with, all sorts of activities that doesn't just have to be this ultimatum of this activity counts or doesn't count, which is why I don't even really like to give a time frame of like, oh, we had, sex at this point because of your continuum language. And that's really what I want to put out there of to reframe, take back what's really on the table of intimacy. And to your point, whether you've had a severe injury or not, the spectrum is so wide.
Thank you for that reframing from your own perspective on this. I really love that you didn't lay out any particular time frame in your answer, because you're right, it is not important. What's important is that you didn't shy away from the journey, and recognizing that you're still on your own journey and you're on a journey as a couple. Mm-hmm. And on that note, I think, my final question for you that's kind of like looking into the future, but that also looks back on our past, is that I remember that we spent a fair amount of time fairly early on, and it seemed perhaps misplaced, or like what's happening to both of us as we talk through this, what's our motivation. But we did pretty early on start talking about, what does this mean for your future childbearing decisions? And so I wonder if you can sort of recap a little bit of that and then tell us, if at all you've moved through that or where you're at.
Sure, yeah. So in that 1 week postpartum meeting that was very emotional with my provider, talking through everything, one of the nuggets that she did share with me, she just said, in case I'm not your provider in the future, having been the one that just, helped, repair you, it is my strong recommendation that if you choose to have another baby, that you have a C-section and do not go through a vaginal delivery. And honestly, that's probably the most talked about topic in the group. Maybe the sex is second. And then the most talked about in my 4th degree tear group is for people who've gone on to have babies, have they had a vaginal delivery or C-section? Because there's a lot of, I don't know, that's kind of a whole gamut of what's recommended. And it seems to be on a case-by-case basis and what the providers are comfortable with. But all that to say, from week 1, it was planted in my brain of future children. And again, my body wasn't really able to handle this. And now nothing wrong with C-sections, but it's still a lot for me, it confirmed the enormity of my injury, that would be, the recommendation was that like, we don't think your body can handle this again. So that did have a big impact on me. And I think I was turning that over. And even in those early weeks where you can't even fathom another delivery, it kind of just, at least it thrust that into the forefront where it didn't really belong. So I think we had maybe some initial conversations about that, Tanya, and then I tried to just, put it out of my brain. And even as I was, Clover would outgrow her clothes, I would, put them in just a nondescript box, right? I'm not saving them for the next baby. I'm not, I had kind of the space to just, it's just clothes she's outgrown, and really not, making any decisions about that because it was stressful. And then actually within the last probably month, I had been sharing with a friend about, again, we're hitting that year, and it's a lot of times in the mom world of like, well, what are you thinking for the second? And I had just really candidly said to her, like, I think I'd be okay just never having to do this again. And I kind of said it in jest and kind of just said it, also serious. I'd never really been honest about that. And she casually just said, only children is totally an option. She's like, there's actually this beautiful podcast that, I've listened to because she's on her same journey with deciding about next steps. And I will plug the podcast. It's Only You, a one and done podcast. And it has changed my life. I'm not kidding when I say that podcast has changed my life. And this concept of having only one child and getting to be done for no other reason than I want to be done. And so that is a new revelation, and something that Adrian and I have been talking and sharing a little bit more openly with some of our friends and family about our feelings towards that, because from early on in our relationship had said no kids or kids. We'd walk through both of those realities in, a lot of detail, but this middle lane of one kid was not really anything we talked about. He comes from a big family, so do I. And I didn't realize how much throughout my recovery, and perhaps prompted by that provider comment in the first week, was every step forward I made, it still felt like it's someday I have to get back on this carousel and figure out what pregnancy is going to be like and figure out what birth is going to be like, given all of these, precarious, like specifics, with my experience, and to recognize that's a choice. Like, it's totally a choice. And I, at this point in time, obviously everything can change, feel a lot of empowerment and the most amount of peace that I have throughout this whole journey. And when I finally let myself say, this is our family, and we can only go on the up and up, and I can only keep healing, and we can only keep having more memories with Clover and not have to, tiptoe back into that treacherous world, which for me is as ripe with trauma as someone saying, do you want to go through another 12 rounds of chemotherapy? Like in my brain, it's stored that way. And I wish that wasn't the case. It is. And so I'm on such a soapbox about this because it's been such a recent revolution for me. As a modern woman and thinking I'm so evolved, but realizing what narratives I had in my head about the 2.5 kid expectation. And I just, like I said, can't plug that podcast enough because it really opened my eyes of, wow, I haven't thought about what good could come with one kid, and how right that felt in my bones.
Well, I'm an only child. My husband is an only child. So I can attest to the fact that it can all be okay when you aren't one of a big brood. I do have an enormous bunch of cousins, and they felt like siblings when I was a child. But whatever. It's This is a choice, and I think now for your sake, I hope that society learns a lesson that they certainly didn't learn for me. Because I was such a young mom, people just always assumed at some point I would have another kid. And so I got really sick of hearing people say, when are you going to have another? And it's just such an annoying thing. And I think we are bringing these points bubbling to the surface as we talk more and more about language and appropriate ways to talk to each other in the world. So I do have hope for you that it will be better, but it probably won't be gone. So you'll have to, take some deep breaths and thicken your skin to those comments, figure out what your interesting response will be, all of that stuff. But yeah, it's interesting to hear where you have landed, whether it's for the moment or forever. None of that even matters. I love that you are easygoing enough to say people change their mind about things. So I don't know for sure, but this is what I think I feel. And it certainly sounds very well thought out, super reasonable, all of those things. Oh,
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
this has been very helpful, and healing's not the right word. I didn't need healing from your experience, but I have a feeling that is in that realm that I don't have a word for. That feels really good, and it's because you're on my mind a lot. I think about you a lot and wonder how you're doing. And so I'm so happy to hear that you are on quite a good path. Things might not be perfect. You're certainly changed forever. But I really am so happy to have had this touch point with you, and I really hope we'll have it again.
Yeah, I hope so too. And I know it's a long, winding story with a lot of detail that can't really be replicated, but I think that's kind of the paradox of motherhood, is that it happens all around us. And yet, while all of it is seemingly the same, like nobody's experience can be replicated. And so I have such empathy towards any degree of hardship that anybody's facing in their pregnancy journey, in their, motherhood journey. And like I said in the beginning, I just want to bring down that veil that there is space for everyone's struggle, and you don't have to have torn all the way through to have the right to claim that you're having a hard time, and it comes in all different shapes and forms. And so anything I can do to continue to be part of this narrative. I love your work for exactly filling in and helping birthing parents in all of the gray areas and peculiar natures that it impacts us. So I think my final words, if I will, for people just going through any kind of hardship related to the pregnancy and birth world, it's assemble a team, whatever that needs to look like. If that's your therapist, if that's a postpartum midwife like Tanya, if that's your OB, if that's your pelvic floor PT, a team for you, not a team necessarily for baby, because there's a lot of those that exist too, but find that professional team. And then, also from a personal standpoint, one thing that I did very differently navigating this journey versus my cancer journey was I was really transparent about how hard it's been with the key people in my life that needed to know. And we were in a time of pandemic. We are in a time of pandemic where they weren't there to see me in person and know how bad it was. And it really was on me to let them in to the depths and the darkness of that time. And so in addition to my key, mom, sister, husband, I had a couple key friends that in those early weeks when it was unraveling and like, oh my God, I'm in for a really long haul. Like this is bad and it's hard. I had a few key friends in that moment that I sent the very same long text about, here's what's happening with me. It's awful. It's not the normal postpartum journey. The details that I felt comfortable sharing. And most importantly, I'm not looking for your words to fix this. I don't need your words to fix this, but I need you to know how bad this is, so that when I army crawl my way out of this hole, 1 inch at a time, you can celebrate those inch milestones with me. And that's been a huge lifesaver for me as I've been moving through this recovery journey, and some wisdom that I've gained. Whereas on the cancer side, I was a lot more protective and kind of walled off. I had to let people in. And again, with not being in person, you have to be the one to communicate that, whether it's via text. So, but they wouldn't have known had I not told them. And now, every little milestone I had was able to share with them, and they understood the magnitude of that. And so I felt so much less isolated in this experience for that reason, partly through the social media experience that I had with my 4th degree tear group, but also from people in my real life. And I should note, a couple of those friends don't even have kids, so aren't familiar with a normal postpartum journey. And so it was extra important that I sort of lay it all out for them transparently. And so that's really kind of my 2 cents, is that, again, there is just a kind of a cruel randomness to the world, but we don't have to be alone in it. And with professional support, and by transparently, communicating with those in our life, we can, let some light in.
Yeah. Wow. That's deep. Okay. So as we wrap, I want to say that Katrina wrote out her own tips for anyone who might be listening who has a 4th degree, or anyone who's interested in hearing what her tips are. And these are tips very clearly not from a healthcare provider. They're from the patient perspective on this. But I definitely want to share her tips, because I think certainly the people who stuck it out with us for these 2 hours are going to want to read that. So I want to make sure to share it with them. Katrina, thank you so much for everything and for your openness.
Thank you, Tanya. I'm grateful. There's midwives and support teams like you. I benefited immensely, and I know so many other moms have, and grateful to just, again, be speaking towards this narrative that I believe so much in.
Hey everyone, it's me, Tanya, your host here at the Mother Wit podcast. You know, I sometimes invite my clients on the show to talk about their birth stories and postpartum experiences, but I want to tell you a little bit more about what those clients and I actually do together. I started Mother Wit to help people in the perinatal period achieve their health and wellness goals. That means whether you're hoping to conceive and struggling with high blood pressure or high blood sugar, or you're having trouble managing anxiety or depression in the postpartum period, or maybe you just need support and advocacy between prenatal or postpartum visits, I can help. Get a discount on your first consultation with me at motherwitmaternity.com using the code FIRSTCONSULT 10% off. That's 10% symbol, all one word. I'm looking forward to working with you and maybe having you on the show too.